Good afternoon, everyone. Today, our special guest is Marc Girardot. He has come up with a extraordinarily interesting proposal hypothesis for vaccine injury, and it kind of ties in all the vaccine injury together and gives a very credible explanation for what could be causing these fatal and disabling syndromes. So Marc, tell our audience a bit about yourself and the work you've been doing.
Uh, I'm Frank. I'm a Franco-American. I'm based out of Paris, France. The Eiffel Tower is right there, almost in front of me. Good morning or good evening, everyone. My background is business and consulting. I've worked in a variety of fields. I have over 30 years of a professional experience, notably working in Silicon Valley for Cisco. I was the head of Cisco's advisory services for the automotive industry. And a few years back, I helped out a friend who had a scale up here in Paris with a DNA anti-cancer vaccine. So right before COVID, I had a deep dive into the latest and greatest immunology. And when COVID hit, I applied my skills to try to understand, like everybody else, what was going on. I worked a bit with Michael Leavitt on the epidemiology early on, and joined Pandata with Nick Hudson late 2020. And immediately in 2021, my work in epidemiology had showed me something was wrong with the vaccine, very, almost immediately. So I was one of the first to raise the alarm at Panda. I later continued the work on being on the scientific steering committee that Steve Kirsch set up with Jessica Rose, Durham Brittle, Peter McCullough, and Matthew Crawford, and a few others. And what I did was apply the scientific method, or actually the root cause analysis that is so used in the automotive space, where quality is so important. And I went and looked at all the accidents, the autopsies, and applied the method in extremely rigorous way, and developed a whole theory or whole framework explaining the vaccine harm. And it spans mRNA vaccines. It goes way beyond. It actually spans beyond vaccines to other injectables. But the fundamental, the gist of it is that we are injecting billions of injections or injectables every year with a protocol that's 200 years old. And that protocol is not calibrated, it's not standardized, and it actually doesn't comply with what the vaccine manufacturers have been telling us, i.e., it's not growing via the lymphatic system and the lymph nodes. It's actually going directly in IV. That's what I've discovered. That's a very substantial discovery, because that's the fact that it's not calibrated and standardized means that it's literally a Russian roulette, depending on a number of elements, and I'll try and describe that a bit later. But fundamentally, you're taking a huge risk, because the vaccines are, in the case of the mRNA vaccines, 10 to 50 billion nanoparticles that are each cytotoxic. So every single one of these lipid nanoparticles has the capacity to tell your immune system to destroy any cells it's going to penetrate. And when you think of the quantity, it's like, it's the analogy would be expecting to be shot at with a dodgy bulletproof vest.
Mm. Mm. Well, so we're playing Russian roulette with what appears to be the vast majority of the childhood population. So, well, go in and tell us what did you find? Let's get into this bolus theory here, because we got to get to the bottom of why all of our children are being severely harmed.
Well, that's exactly what I did. It's actually very mechanistic, and it applies, scientific laws that are proven, and just a series of them for a big part of the theory. There's a part on cancer which is conjectural, but is very much strengthened by a lot of evidence. So I'm going to get you through that. So if anybody's interested in my work, they can go to my Substack. There's my Substack called the Bolus Theory series. There's over 100 different articles on numerous topics, ranging from cancer to obesity and cures. Notably, here you see the one on oxygen therapy. And if you really want to do a deep dive, there's my book, The Needle's Secret, that explains everything in detail. So this is what I was telling you. Every single intramuscular delivery is flawed, the Russian roulette. And when you repeat a Russian roulette multiple times, you end up harming people, right? And that explains the chronic disease crisis that we're facing entirely. And so it's a very significant discovery, and you'll see it. What is absolutely, which surprised me, is that 100% of the injections go IV. They might go at a different speed, and with different concentrations. But for example, when doctors give epinephrine because they have a crisis and they want to save somebody who's having a heart attack, for example, they expect the epinephrine to get to the heart within a minute. How do they inject it? Well, they inject it with saline intramuscularly.
So why would vaccines not do the same thing?
Exactly. If vaccines are also saline, so necessarily vaccines get to the heart within a minute. Now, it might be 1,000th of the dose, but a thousandth of the dose is still 10 million nanoparticles.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So there's a number of key observations that people are putting aside too quickly. The first observation is that these vaccines were intended for cancer, and therefore their intent is to have T cells attack tumor cells. And that's what we're simulating with these NLPs. And so each of these NLPs is cytotoxic, okay? It's actually pretty funny because a lot of people are thinking, oh, there's poison in these vaccines. Well, no, these vaccines are poison in small dose, okay? The second observation, which is very important and has left most people puzzled, is the dichotomy of experiences. Some people are unharmed. It's a reality. You have to acknowledge that. And then some people are injured or die. Necessarily, they're not getting the same experience, even though they're injecting the same product with the same dose. So something is changing the toxicity, and we know that toxicity is always related to dose. Third point is from at least two studies, Nakahara et al. And Berger et al., one in Japan, one in Basel University Hospital. We know that all the vaccinated hearts capillaries were leaky after the vaccines, 100%, nearly 100%. That means that all the vaccinated are hit, but they're not necessarily harmed in the sense that their bodies are capable of repairing. So, our bodies have unique capabilities of repairing themselves, thankfully. Um, and the problem is when you reach the limit of the body's capability to repair. The fourth observation, which is also fundamental, is when you look at Vair's report, there's hardly any necrosis at the injection point. Actually, last time I checked, there was 16 necrosis at injection point, but they were not really at the injection point. They were in the fat or there. But even if it were 15 out of 13 billion shot, it's not poison inside. There's no poison with the dose. If it were, you would have necrosis at the injection sites. So it's something else. Fifth observation is when you look at the autopsies and you read all of them, systematically the adverse events are immune mediated. Okay, it's the immune reaction to the vaccine that's causing the harm. Some people have been talking about the circulating spike, but no, that's not what we're seeing. What the evidence shows is lymphocytes attacking endothelial cell for most of them and creating chaos there. And another observation is the way they attack is strange. They attack in a concentrated fashion, as if the transfection, as if the nanoparticles had penetrated en masse, massively, like they had carpet bombed the endothelium, the linings of the blood vessels. That is physically impossible if the dose trickles down the lymphatic system and it's a drip by drip, because the vascular system does one thing very well. It disseminates. It disseminates oxygen. It disseminates nutrients across the body. And therefore, you cannot have a concentrated hit. That's why in medicine, when you want to deliver drug in a concentrated fashion, you inject intravenously and create a bolus. This concentrated transfection, these concentrated attacks from the immune system can only mean one thing. The people who are suffering from these accidents are being injected a big dose intravenously directly. The last or eighth point, or I lost count, is it's essentially the linings of the blood vessels who are hit. And that makes sense because if the nanoparticles are leaking the muscle and going directly into the vasculature, they're actually in a sort of a concealed area where there's the lining and the capillaries are all into the endothelium, basically. So the only cells, or most of the cells they can hit, have to be the endothelium. And that's what we're seeing. There's multiple studies showing D-dimers, showing that it's the endothelium that is the first victim of these vaccines. Now, that was really mostly my observations and my takeaways from autopsies, biopsies, hundreds of them that I've read these past 4 years. But at one point, I've come to the realization that what I was seeing was not specific to mRNA vaccines. The concentrated destruction of endothelial cells can happen with other vaccines, or potentially with poison or toxins that are injected as a bolus. And indeed, when you actually do the work, you find out that all the vaccines trigger the exact same adverse reactions that we've been seeing. They trigger arteriosclerosis, they trigger purpuras, they trigger cancer, they trigger, of course, thrombosis and thrombocytopenia. Now, before I dive in, there's a few key facts that people need to realize. Toxicity is all about dose. Every cell that is immune sensitive is going to be destroyed by the immune system. That's a reality. That's a scientific immunological reality that actually the vaccine manufacturers are not discounting. They admit that. And if you damage the endothelium, you are simulating a cut. And what does a cut do? It triggers coagulation. So any harm that is caused to the endothelium by T cells, simply physically destroying them, is equivalent to triggering a coagulation cascade. And I'll explain what that means. And that's another very important point that I came to realize at one point, is there are certain cells that, if they are contaminated by the vaccines, are not going to be destroyed by the immune system. These are immune privileged. They are royalty, if you will, and they are the famous stem cells. And that's one of my realization is, if indeed we agree that cancers are being triggered these vaccines, which seems to be the case, then it could only be via the contamination of stem cells, because they're only surviving cells. And you'll see how that works. And I've come up with a completely new theory of cancer, which is upside down. Because when you look at it, first of all, there are many scientists in the past 20 years who have been saying cancer cells and origins are actually stem cells. And second, all the characteristics of cancer cells are actually characteristics of stem cells. So p53 inhibition, hTERT, glycolysis, alkaline environments, mid-bodies, etc. Every single one of them. In other words, my theory is that we are triggering cancer with vaccines and other injectables by creating a bolus, because then we reach them in a way niches where typically contaminants in the blood don't reach them. Okay,
very interesting. Very interesting.
So this is what I was telling you. Why would stelline with vaccine stay in the muscle when stelline with epinephrine hits the heart under a minute? It's impossible. Okay, so it's a fallacy, or I am not saying people lied. I'm saying it's a fallacy. It's a scientific fallacy, and I will explain why it's a fallacy and how it works in the coming slides. That's the first point. The second point is, there's a recent study that was done. I think it was done in Korea, if I'm not wrong, that did the distribution of the vaccine on mice again. And what they found out was that the draining lymph node, which is supposed to be the first organ taking the big wave with the highest number of undiluted NLPs, is not more hit than other lymph nodes in the body. And that can only mean one thing. Is that the main part of the dose is going intravascular directly and avoids that lymph node. Now, let me try and explain why intramuscular injections go IV. And actually, to a certain extent, I'm pretty sure subcutaneous injection also. But here's what happens. When you insert the needle, right, into the muscle, you can see that the muscle is highly vascularized, right? So you're going to cut through multiple vessels. Some are going to be extremely small, 10 micrometer capillaries, a lot of them. Some are going to be arterioles that are going to be a bit bigger, and sometimes it's going to be a millimeter artery or 2 millimeter artery. So there, it's unavoidable that the needle, even if it's well injected according to protocol, is going to cut through multiple blood vessels. And when you are going to inject the saline, basically, with the vaccine particles, the 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 liquid is going to expand, as is shown on chart or this drawing number 3. It's going to expand, and any of the cut vessels that are near that needle's tip is going to intake a bolus, because the pressure differential is going to be extremely important, and liquids go to the points of least resistance. We know that. That's another, law of physics. So you're in that first instance, especially when nurses or doctors or actually trainees inject very quickly. There could be, by my calculation, if, for example, a 10 micrometer capillary is right next to the needle, it'll take 10 million nanoparticles immediately, instantly. If it's bigger, it can take the entire dose. So the dose is going to expand, and it's going to create extra pressure in the muscle. And then that pressure is going to push the liquid back into all of those vessels that it cut. And so what you're going to see is exactly what we saw in the Acuitas study, for example, or in the epinephrine study, is a high peak, immediate peak. Within 15 minutes, you're going to have most of the dose go there, and then progressively the leak within an hour. So what that means is, let's take the conservative approach. You have about 10 billion nanoparticles in the Pfizer vaccine. You're going to send 10 billion nanoparticles, first highly concentrated during that first 5 minutes, okay, or even 10 minutes, highly concentrated dose, directly into the vascular system. And that's a very significant point, because instead of having a slow trickle and a very low concentration into the bloodstream with multiple hits, but extremely disseminated across, with the body's capacity to simply negate cells that have been destroyed by the immune system, what you're going to have is a bolus, highly concentrated bolus, that is going to expose the linings to a high intensity carpet bombing. And the T cells that are going to come after that are going to recognize that the wall linings have been contaminated entirely sometimes, and are going to strip them away. And we've never evolved for this type of harm. We've never evolved for this type of harm because normally, and I'll describe that a bit later, but the type of harm we've evolved for is cross-sectional, right? You cut through the muscle or the finger or the skin, but we've never had to evolve for longitudinal harm along our arteries. So first, before I go into this discussion, let me explain what happens. So the injector inserts a needle, injects the vaccine into your muscle. It goes directly into a vein or an artery. Depending on where it goes, it's going to go back to the vena cava. It's going to go to the right side of your heart. It's going to be pumped into your five pulmonary nodes, and be sent to the left part of your heart. During that first transit, it's going to start losing the coating that the nanoparticles have, which impedes them from clogging together in the form of a fat blob, if you will, that is extremely dangerous and would also have made the injection impossible. So there's this coating, and this coating actually um, preserved the lungs of many people. Let's be very honest. I'm not against PEG. I think, thankfully, PEG avoided many people of having their lungs completely destroyed. But what happens is as the NLP circulates the right chambers and the capillaries, they're going to erode they're going to lose that coating, and they're going to start getting activated. And so what you have is, I described that in my book, The Needle Secret, is you have an increasingly dangerous concentration, as at the same time the cloud of particles is disseminating. So if you have a window of opportunity, if I will, of harm is more the right term, you have a short window whereby most likely during the first or two cycles of that first bolus, but it lasts an hour, harm is going to happen. That's been happening for over a century, by the way. It's not limited to mRNA vaccines or to these vaccines. That explains why we've seen an explosion of chronic disease because of the increase in the number of shots. The more you shoot, you inject individuals, especially children, the more scenario 3 is going to happen. And it's going to go places. It can go anywhere in the body. And some places are more sensitive than others, of course. So if you hit fat or if you hit a muscle, it can be benign and your body will be able to deal with it. But if it starts hitting capillaries in the hearts, capillaries in the brain, you're going to have issues. And I'm going to describe these issues.
So we're just carpet bombing. We're carpet bombing everybody, it appears. Russian roulette, and then they face this disaster that goes throughout their whole body. Yeah. So what does this lead to? I mean, so clearly it can't be good, right?
It's not good, and the point I'd like to make is, a scientific theory needs to be reproducible. Okay. And the Bolus theory, at least the cardiovascular aspects of it, is already reproduced multiple times. It's reproduced in 3 different studies. One Pfizer study that was done in Hong Kong University. There's another one in Munich with the AstraZeneca, and there was another one more recently. Every time they injected to mice these vaccines intravascularly, they manage producing the exact same adverse reaction: thrombosis, T-cell attacks, calcification of the heart, for, of course, inflammation in the liver, in the heart, and elsewhere. Yeah, and they had been doing that before also with other vaccines. Okay, so these are the 2 studies, for example, with other vaccines. And that's a very important point, because the theory needs to be explainable, which is what I'm doing right now. but also it needs to be tested. And it has been tested by different people across the globe with different vaccines, but with the mRNA vaccines, with the DNA vaccines, and it's doing exactly the same thing. It's also been shown in accidents to prove the same thing. So there's the story of Milo Edberg, who was a 6-year-old child who was injected the Pfizer vaccine in December 2021, if I recall well, directly into his blood port, and he suffered major problems in the lungs. He had myocarditis. He he had Guillain-Barré syndrome, and he was hospitalized. I think he was in a coma for 6 or 7 weeks, if I recall well. There is also, what really is surprising is, I've been telling you this for nearly 4 years now, and everybody's discounting my work, but veterinarians know that. So if you go on, this study here is on 3 cows that died of an intravenous injection of vaccines, and their lungs were completely destroyed. So veterinarians know full well the risk of accidental intravenous injections of vaccines. I'm explaining what happens and why. Now, I'm not so sure everybody can read all of this, but there is 2 sides to my my theory. On the right, I'm not so sure what you're reading. On the left side is all the cardiovascular damage caused by considerable concentrated damage on the endothelium. On the right side is the damage that occurs to stem cells and the consequences. I'm going to run you through all the different blocks if you're interested. You tell me I'm going too much into the details of it, of the theory. The left side is entirely unequivocal and is backed up by solid science, by scientific laws. It's not even arguable. The right side is part is conjectural on the cancer side, and I explain why. But the genetic tinkering side is physical tinkering. It's physical interactions of the contaminants inside the stem cells when they divide, and also that cannot be contested. So let me it explains how all the adverse reactions can be explained in this framework. Okay, every single one of them. And I'm going to try and show you some examples. So this is what I was telling you, okay? It's 2 types of cells: endothelial cells, longitudinal harm, or stem cells in the niches that are unprotected when they are contaminated. On the cardiovascular side, it took me a little while to understand that, but what's happening is simply imbalances into the repair. So a normal repair, as you can see on the left side of my graph, of my drawing here, is you would have a cross-sectional cut, and the repair would come into the fractals of the vascular system. So it would naturally be well allocated, okay? Now imagine you have 1,000 cuts on an artery, right? You have millions and millions of nanoparticles hitting the sides, T cells coming in and stripping the entire layer. How do you repair that? Well, the repair, of course, you would have a huge demand for repair, huge demand for coagulation, huge demand for endothelial stem cells, huge demand for VEGF, so basically angiogenesis, vascular creating new vessels, revascularizing, sorry. But the problem is the whole harm is longitudinal. So the repair is going to come upstream, and it's going to be monopolized upstream, right? If you have a need upstream for coagulation, all the coagulation is going to happen there. If you have a need for angiogenesis, all the angiogenesis is going to happen there. And that means that you're not going to have enough of those factors downstream. So if you're trying to repair, for example, the endothelium is going to have trouble being repaired downstream because everything is monopolized upstream. Therefore, you're going to have calcification downstream, because if you leave the blood vessels without an endothelium, you're going to have very quickly, in the case of, for example, the Hong Kong studies has shown the hearts were calcified within 24 hours. So it's a very, very quick process. And you're also going to have lack of coagulation factors on downstream. So a big part of the damage is these imbalances. I can't tell you, nobody can tell you how much of which is happening. It depends on circumstances. But what you can be certain of is this is happening. The imbalance is unavoidable because we've never evolved for that. Now, if you get 1,000 cuts, right, you are going to trigger a demand for coagulation, which is abnormal. Okay, so I don't know why so many researchers have been, investigating thrombosis and coming up with all sorts of weird, antibodies that are supposedly triggering factor 4, whatever. It's simple. The more you damage the endothelium, the more coagulation factor you're going to need, and we've never evolved for that kind of damage. So of course we're going to deplete the coagulation factors. So it explains both thrombosis, but also thrombocytopenia. Thrombocytopenia is simply that we've never evolved to be producing, coagulation factors in such quantities. And so with this huge response of coagulation, the coagulation inhibitors are going to be sometimes overwhelmed, and you're going to have thrombosis. Okay, so that means ischemia, strokes, thrombosis, and thrombocytopenia. But of course, when that lands into into capillaries, you're also going to have necrosis, and I'm going to touch on that later on. When you have thrombocytopenia downstream, that's what I was telling you, and you're not having, you have the bare layer of smooth muscle layer, the second layer, you're going to have calcification. You're going to have plaque. With plaque, you'll have arteriosclerosis or atheromas, okay, which almost all American adults have today, at least all the vaccinated ones. This is going to be extremely common because everybody's is getting 100% of the dose is going through the arteries, the hearts, the lungs, and the arteries. So this is going to be extremely common. And when you have calcification in areas like, for example, the circle of Willis, the Willis circle in the brain, where you have high flow, in some instances, the calcification is going to be broken off. And the second layer, the smooth muscle layer, is going to be stripped off. Okay, so that's why you have aneurysms and dissections. That's a conjecture, that's an hypothesis, but I think it's a good one. You have calcification in an area where the blood flow is extremely dense. It's going to strip the plaque away, take away some of those cells. We've never evolved for having plaque over there. And then you are left with a completely emptied out vessel, and you will create an aneurysm and potentially a dissection. It's quite. It seems to me so obvious that I'm surprised that nobody has been talking about that. Now, there is another problem that is going to happen. Of course, if you have this huge coagulation, it's going to happen on the surface. Okay, so you're going to have a band-aid, a natural band-aid, over whatever surface has been destroyed by the T cell, right? So coagulation factor, platelets, red blood cells, some destroyed debris of cells, spike proteins going to be in there, etc., are going to be creating this mesh, this band-aid mesh on those walls. It's a natural phenomenon. It's a repair. It's to protect ourselves. The problem is that normally, as you're saying, the damage is cross-sectional. And normally the trigger to dissolve the clots, the coagulation, is triggered by endothelial cells neighboring them. So they basically, once there's a signal, once the repair is done, to trigger an activator, a plasmin activator, and plasmin being activated is supposed to dissolve the clots, dissolve the fibrin. Now, if you have a very, very long clots or band-aid on the surface of your walls, your vessel walls, there is no signal anymore, right? And if there's no signal, you cannot dissolve the fibrin. What happens next is anything that is in the clot that is cellular related, red blood cells, platelets, all the debris from the destroyed cells that are being stuck in there are going to be cleaned up by the macrophages. And what you're going to end up is those white clots, mostly fibrin with some spike proteins and some elements in there. But it's no longer going to be red, it's going to be white, and mostly white. All of that's fibrin. A bit like, I don't know if you know 3D printing, but there are ways where you have two materials where you print metal and wax. And at one point you dissolve you melt the wax and you end up with a structure of metal. It's very similar here. The white clots are very similar in nature. That's what I suppose or conjecture is happening with the white clots. And
So
white
do you
clots
think the white clots are more pathogenic and more, can they cause more damage than, say, a classical clot?
they are going to, no, they're going to cause the same thing. I mean, you have both, right? It's when there's a tube formed and the blood can circulate. The problem with those white clots long term is they're going to start clogging. So it's sort of a delayed thrombosis, if you will. And the more time passes, the larger the arteries concerned are going to be clogging. So that's very dangerous. We've seen some of that. I know from one of my readers who's been using some of my material to cure himself, that POTS is related to white clots because he had used first of all hyperbaric oxygen therapy to solve just about everything else that he had, but he still had white clots, and we had a conversation and came to the conclusion that the white clots in his legs, arteries, were impeding constriction when you stand up. And he took he took high dose nitrokinase for some time and felt better very, very quickly. So the nitrokinase dissolved the white clots. Now, there's one thing before before people get excited about nattokinase is you have to understand that these white clots are natural and they're here to prevent hemorrhage and sometimes uh, um, blood entering areas it's not supposed to enter. You know, if you know Steve Kirch, that's what Steve lost an eye because of that. He had literally he must have had a white clot in an eye capillary. When he took nattokinase, he started bleeding into his eye and he lost an eye. So it's very important to understand that there's a reason these white clots are natural. They're not all bad. They're extremely dangerous long term. Uh, but before getting rid of the white clots, people need to repair the endothelium and the capillaries behind because there's a whole bunch of illnesses tied to blood entering without the blood tissue barrier tissue. In some cases, it's only going to create inflammatory problem, but in some other cases, it's going to be extremely dangerous. So these are the three. It's exactly what your question was. That is, there are three ways you can have ischemic necrosis, either by product aggregation. For example, that happens to steroids injection with oil. You can get oil-based embolisms because of that. So that happens, for example, to bodybuilders when they inject steroids intramuscularly. They have what happens is called Trenkov, but when the oil aggregates in the capillaries, it's going to create necrosis downstream from that, right? You can have that also in short term when you have overwhelming coagulation factors, as I said, or later on, medium term to long term, blood elements that aggregate on plaque or on white clots. Plaque is more known, white clots is not as known, but that creates necrosis, is going to create a lot of problems. It can be blindness, deafness, it can be dementia, it can be Guillain-Barré, it can be infertility, it can be all sorts of organ failures, endocrine disorders, when basically you lose out capacity to produce and secrete hormones. That's what is happening. You've actually simply destroyed the organ. And that's something that you can marginally recover from, but it's it's mostly difficult. So for, I have two friends who've lost a pulmonary node. You can't grow that back. Gallbladder, you can't grow it back. But you can marginally when there is, and I'll talk about oxygen therapy and there's ways you can actually rebuild some function, some part of the tissue by revascularizing the organs if they're not destroyed completely. Now, a very big, I don't know if it's a discovery of mine, but at least I'm the only person that actually is explaining it, is capillary leakage, and it's permanent capillary leakage. This is the same problem that we've seen, but instead of having behind the smooth muscle layer, there is nothing left. What you do when that occurred is you destroy the blood tissue barrier. Okay, so that can happen in any organ, but in every single organ in our body, the endothelium in the capillary plays that role. It's a protective role that selects the elements in the blood that are allowed to enter the tissue or whatever is behind. One, and two, it's also regulating elements that are produced in that tissue. It could be immune cells, it could be hormones, it could be enzymes. If you destroy that, you're going to lose the capacity to regulate it. So this is an extremely important discovery, is that in some instances, the vaccines and other injectables, when they arrived in concentration in the capillary and they destroy that layer, it's sometimes very difficult for the body to repair completely. Why? Because most likely it's small, it's far away, it's disseminated, and the message is not getting through. So if ever the endothelial stem cells that are supposed to come in to repair those capillaries are monopolized upstreams in the arteries where there's huge damage, then you have a permanent leak in those blood tissue barriers. What does that mean? It means that you are poisoning your tissue wherever the leak is. Now, for example, if it's in the brain, if you have a blood-brain barrier leak, you are going to have toxic material entering your brain. It's going to cause inflammation. It's going to cause degeneration. And as your immune system ages, it's going to cause accumulation. So that's why, anybody who knows a bit about neurodegenerative disease knows that the first and foremost step is blood-brain barrier leakage. Okay? And a lot of people have hypothesized as to why that was happening, stress or whatever. What I'm saying is injected vaccines is causing that. Mostly. I mean, there are other things that you can inject that can do that, but vaccines got to be 80% or 90% of neurodegenerative disease sources, origin. This is also going to cause all the autoimmune diseases. The immune system doesn't make mistakes. Humans do. Okay? If you have inflammation somewhere, it's not because the immune system is going haywire. It's because something that's not supposed to be there is there, and the immune system is reacting. And so, if you have, elements of, for example, of undigested gluten, for example, you're going to create inflammation. And if it's in your joints, you're going to have arthritis. If it's in your intestines, you're going to have leaky gut, celiac, Crohn's disease. If it's in the nerves, you're going to have neuropathies. What I'm trying to say is this is a sort of cookie cutter thing. Capillary leakage leads to a huge number of modern day chronic diseases, and it's fixable. It's very easy to fix through oxygen therapy, notably. Let me get to something that's more conjectural, but is in my opinion extremely compelling. If you admit that all the immune sensitive cells are that are contaminated by the vaccines are destroyed by T cells, the only cells that can trigger cancer have to be those that survive. In other words, stem cells and progenitor cells. That was a very big ha-ha moment, as I told you, for me 2 years ago. And I've been investigating that, trying to understand what was going on. And if you study evolution and the way stem cells have evolved, you realize that stem cells have an Achilles heel and that they need to be protected and hidden away from contaminants. Why do I say that? Well, because they are hidden away in niches in the bone marrow. They have their own fuel system. They don't get oxygen. They don't work with oxygen, which means that they've been hidden away from the blood so that contaminants like of course viruses and bacteria and other elements can harm them. They have an alkaline environment so that if ever there's a virus in them, the virus stays dormant, okay, etc. Now, when I investigated, oxygen therapy, I found out that stem cells divide when contaminated by oxygen. They don't divide, they divide maybe 3 or 4 times to avoid reactive oxygen species. Okay. Now, my hypothesis, my conjecture is that once they get contaminated by a virus or by a vaccine, stem cells, stem cells have two possibilities. Either they're dormant and they shut down the NLP, if it's an NLP, or they do just like when they're contaminated by oxygen, they divide very quickly to protect the genetic matrix. Now, if that happens, they're going to have to divide quite a lot, because there's quite a lot of spike proteins that can be produced. There's quite a lot of DNA contamination, etc. And if that happens, then you end up with an excess in stem cell capacity, which means that whenever you're going to have demand later on for stem cells, instead of having, I have this analogy, instead of you're ordering a burger in a restaurant, instead of having one cook in the kitchen, you have 100 cooks in the kitchen, but they're not collaborating, communicating, and then you end up with 100 burgers. Every time you're going to have a demand for stem cells, you're going to have thousands of excess stem cells produced. And Kevin McKernan has done some great work whereby he investigated colon cancer cells. And what did he find out? He found out that the spike protein was in traces. In other words, the evasion by replication mechanism seems to be working. But he also found out that the DNA, the plasmids, had auto-amplified, which also explains, exactly what I'm saying, the multiplication, the mitosis. And that's very important because of another reason on genetic aspects. I want to add another dimension which makes my theory even more compelling. If a stem cell is contaminated, it has different ranking and different scale. And harm, especially cancer, is all about scale. Now, if indeed a contamination event, a vaccine contamination hits a very senior stem cell, a multipotent stem cell, let's say in the bone marrow, the scale of that excess capacity is going to be enormous, and you're going to have a very aggressive cancer, a high-grade cancer. And what's interesting to confirm, I think, it's not going to be differentiated because those cells are not differentiated. If you hit a low-level stem cell, progenitor cell, you're going to have a lower scale because the demand is much more local, okay? But it's going to be differentiated. And that's what you see. High-grade cancers are undifferentiated. Low-grade cancers have receptors and they're differentiated. So this is extremely important. You would get, for example, a neoplasm, which is going to be extremely benign, because extremely low. You're going to have an indolent cancer if it's a bit above, and you're going to have a turboblastic leukemia if it's actually one of those hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow. Now, here is both a conjecture because we haven't heard about genetic problems, but it's a physical reality that is bound to happen. If you have stem cells that are contaminated, these stem cells replicate. The chromosomes or the chromatids, as they're splitting during the mitosis, during cell division, are going to physically interact with the contaminants. That's the physical reality, right? It's like bringing a 747 inside a GM Michigan, a Detroit plant. You bring a 747 thinking that the 747 is not going to disrupt the manufacturing plant is crazy. Of course, it's going to disrupt it in one way or another. And what it does, it's you're going to have three types of problems. One, you're going to have problems with misalignments. So the separation of those two chromatids is going to be hindered entirely. So you're going to have two chromatids going back to one nucleus and zero going back to the other one. And depending on which side predominates, you're going to have trisomy or monosomy. Okay, you're going to be lacking chromosomes. That's people tell me that's fancy. No, it's a reality. It's bound to happen because physically it's happening. You're also going to have, if you have spike protein in the middle, you have chromosome breakup. Okay, if you have DNA, well, it can naturally either stay there and automatically replicate, as we've seen, or potentially integrate into the nucleus. Okay, so those are three things we haven't been seeing yet, but I'm pretty sure in the cancer cells that Kevin looked into, they will find that. And Philippe Burkhouse has been doing some work on stem cells, and that's what he's finding. This is not conjectural. That's quasi certain.
So this is very concerning. You just laid out 12 mechanisms of harm that are all very plausible, and some of them confirmed. And so, this is truly, truly groundbreaking, right? I mean, this, yeah.
It is groundbreaking, and it's very difficult to falsify, I can tell you, because it's reproduced, and it's most of these follows scientific laws that are hematological laws or mathematical laws or physics laws of pharmacodynamics and stuff. I want to talk about hope, because a big part of my book, the Needle Seeker, when I started writing the book, I was a bit desperate, because I was like, I know how to stop this. We can stop this by changing, reevaluating the way vaccines are delivered. Okay, I'm of course you can challenge vaccines if you want, but the first thing you want to do is change the injection technique. It's a 200-year-old technique. Okay, it's, as I said, it's not standardized, it's not calibrated, and it's not going the lymphatic route it's supposed to. So just on those grounds, we should stop all vaccines. Okay, we have compelling grounds to do that. But what's more important also is what do we do with the billions of people who have been harmed these past 40 years, especially in the younger generations, have been hammered by these ill-designed delivery technique. Well, there's multiple ways, but the most effective way is oxygen therapy. Actually, any way that is going to trick the body into thinking that it needs repair, but you don't create harm. So oxygen therapy is tricking the body in thinking that you're exercising and that you're running away from a tiger, and then there's going to be damage, and it's basically triggering stem cell replication system-wide. There is enormous, though most of the research is on hyperbaric oxygen therapy, but even baric oxygen therapy is the same principle. It's actually even safer, it's cheaper, and much easier to undertake at home with an oxygen concentrator. There's a huge industry catering to people who have respiratory distress disorders that is ready, that it has the industry, it has all the tools to do that. And you can help people with all the neurodegenerative diseases, okay, ALS, and of course, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, chronic syndromes, fatigue, but you can also repair leaky gut, Crohn's disease, celiac disease. I think a big part of actually of obesity is also tied to leaky gut, where you're not controlling the fat that's entering, and that's why you have ectopic fat, right? Which basically is fat that's not regulated by the lymphatic system. You can repair also. There's a lot of things that are repairable in the reproductive systems. That endometriosis is also related to leaky capillaries in the endometrium, etc. So, and there's been, my book has been a very small success. Nobody's been, I'm this Frenchman. Actually, I have a U.S. passport, by the way, so I'm not this Frenchman, but I'm far away from the crowd in the U.S. But the people who have read my book and have actually used it to try and cure themselves have had great results. There's been people curing their autistic children with oxygen therapy. There's a gentleman called Willem in New Zealand who had brain fog, who had a stroke, who had major problems. He had POTS, numerous issues, and using oxygen, mild hyperbaric oxygen tent, managed resolving a huge number. Sometimes you can't, fix everything, but you improve the quality of life like 80%. So that's the part I'm most proud of, is having, once you understand what's happening, you can try to figure out how to cure people. And there's what's amazing is I don't have a protocol because I'm not a doctor, but scientifically, what I've found out is that the body did part of the job by coagulating, by doing these white clots, etc. You need to help the body heal and get to the two other stages. And the second stage is basically endothelium repair and revascularization. That's the oxygen therapy, red light therapy, fasting, all the aromatic therapies that are stimulating stem cell production help. But oxygen therapy is, in my opinion, the safest and effective one. So you repair the endothelium, you revascularize what can be revascularized. That takes a lot of time. The endothelium repair typically takes the equivalent of 40 hours of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, so about 100 hours of normal baric oxygen therapy. After that, if you have degenerative disease, there's a lot of revascularization, but you need to continue. For people who have very aggressive degenerative disease like ALS and stuff, you need to be extremely aggressive in the much more aggressive, because otherwise the degeneration is overwhelming the repair, if you will. Fundamentally, that's what I wanted to tell you about today. I don't know if you have any questions. For those who have a book, you can go to my book or you can go to my Substack. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Awesome. Wow. Well, that was absolutely, amazing, that presentation there. And yeah, I urge all of our audience, yeah, go check out his book, The Needle's Secret. Very important information here. So it appears that, so in the past 200 years, we've been acting like barbaric cavemen, doing the same technique for 200 years straight, harming billions of people. So right, that's appears to be what's happening, or what has
Well,
happened.
100 years ago, doctors knew about the risk of intravascular injections, much more than they accept today. So they had invented the aspiration technique, but the aspiration technique was, as we say, a faux semblant. It works only in the rare cases where you're inserted in a vessel. As I demonstrated, most of the injections are done via pressure gradients into the vessels that have been cut, and that the aspiration technique doesn't work. But doctors knew about that, and they were much more prudent in their approaches. Even with Poland or other, you know, this applies to other injectables, Poland, vitamins, anesthetics. Anesthetics, anesthesiologists know about the problem. They're extremely cautious about not going IV too quickly. So for vaccines and even all injectables, but particularly for vaccines that trigger an immune reaction, which means all the inactivated virus vaccines, all the attenuated virus vaccines, the virus-like vaccines, DNA vaccines, etc. These are particularly dangerous when they're injected intravenously.
Mm, well,
Which is
thank you for that. Yep. Yep. All right. Well, Mark, we run out of time here. This is, again, this has been great. Is there any final words you want to tell our audience before we end the stream?
well, if anybody can help me out, get the word out, that's important because I've been fighting this alone for 5 years now, pro bono. So it's hard for me. I want this. I've been sacrificing my life and my family to offer this to the world. It's a solution. It is. There's no, people have been denying this, but there's no denying it scientifically. It's undeniable that this is happening. It's proven. It's replicable. It's generalizable, and we can stop this now. We can stop it now from continuing to happen, and we can also understand what happened in the past decades and how we can cure together all these people. So, this is right down making America great again, healthy again, sorry, making America healthy again. Um, because chronic disease and cancers can be avoided, and this is the way to cure many of the suffering of many people in the US and across the world.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm trying to